Why are American warships suddenly surrounding Venezuela again? Oil tankers are being seized. Accusations of piracy are flying. Russia is demanding answers. And the Caribbean, a place most people associate with beaches and holidays, is starting to feel dangerously tense. It looks like a modern crisis. A new problem. A sudden escalation. But here's the unsettling part. This has already happened before. Same country. Same waters. Same kind of pressure. Same global powers circling. More than a century ago, Venezuela was at the center of a confrontation so serious it almost triggered a world war. Most people have never heard of it. It's rarely mentioned in textbooks. It's barely discussed in history classes. Yet without this forgotten moment, nothing happening today makes sense. Because what you're seeing now is not random. It's not accidental. And it didn't start this year. If you stay until the end of this video, you'll understand why Venezuela keeps returning to the center of global conflict, why America once protected it, and why that protection has now turned into pressure. The answer lies in a decision made over 120 years ago that quietly reshaped the world. Let's go back to where it all began. Most people think today's crisis came out of nowhere. They see sanctions. They see warships. They see oil tankers being stopped at sea. And they assume this is something new. But history tells a different story. In fact, the events unfolding right now follow a very old pattern. A pattern so precise that when you lay the past over the present, the shapes almost match. Back then, Venezuela was accused of breaking international rules. Foreign powers claimed they were owed money. Warships appeared in the Caribbean. Ports were threatened. Pressure mounted. And just like today, Venezuela believed someone powerful would step in to protect it. In 1902, that protector was the United States. At the time, America wasn't attacking Venezuela. It was doing the opposite. It was stopping Europe from touching it. And it did so with a single threat that forced the world's strongest empires to back down. That moment quietly changed how power works in the Western Hemisphere. And once you understand that moment, today's actions stop looking confusing. They start looking inevitable. To see the pattern clearly, we need to understand what Venezuela was like before the crisis exploded. Not today. Not recently. But at the very start of the 20th century, when everything began to unravel. At the start of the 1900s, Venezuela was a broken country. Years of civil war had torn it apart. Governments rose and fell fast. Armies marched. Cities burned. The economy barely functioned. Roads were damaged. Trade slowed. Tax systems collapsed. And while the country struggled to survive, its debts kept growing. European banks had loaned Venezuela huge sums of money. British financiers. German investors. Italian merchants. French companies. They funded railways. They backed plantations. They loaned money to past governments that no longer existed. Now they wanted to be paid back. But Venezuela couldn't pay. Its biggest export, coffee, had crashed in value. Customs revenue was weak. Whatever money entered the treasury went straight to keeping soldiers loyal and rebellions under control. There was nothing left for foreign creditors. From Europe's point of view, Venezuela looked irresponsible. Lawless. Unreliable. From inside Venezuela, it felt like survival. This was the environment where a single man rose to power. A man who would turn debt into defiance. A leader who believed strength mattered more than promises. And his decisions would pull the world's most powerful empires straight toward Venezuela's coast. His name was Cipriano Castro. He did not come from wealth. He did not come from stability. He came from the mountains. In 1899, Castro crossed into Venezuela with a tiny force. Barely dozens of men. Within months, he controlled the capital. Against all odds, he took the presidency by force and declared himself the defender of Venezuelan sovereignty. Castro was bold. Loud. Defiant. He saw foreign debt not as a legal obligation, but as a weapon used against weak nations. When European diplomats asked for repayment, he ignored them. When they demanded compensation, he delayed. When they insisted, he laughed it off. Letters went unanswered. Meetings were refused. Claims were pushed into courts he controlled. And when foreign businesses complained, unrest mysteriously followed. Warehouses were looted. Pressure increased. Fear spread. Castro believed something important. He believed no foreign empire would dare attack Venezuela. Why? Because the United States had promised to protect the Western Hemisphere. Because the Monroe Doctrine stood in the way. Because America would never allow European warships to bully a Latin American nation. Castro was confident. Almost reckless. But in Europe, patience was running out. In Europe, Venezuela was no longer seen as a problem to manage. It was seen as a challenge. Britain was the strongest empire on earth. Its navy ruled the oceans. When Britain demanded payment, nations usually complied. Venezuela didn't. That silence became an embarrassment. Germany felt the same pressure. It was a rising power, eager to prove itself on the world stage. German banks had invested heavily in Venezuela. German merchants dominated trade. German citizens had lost property during Venezuela's civil wars. Berlin wanted results. Italy followed close behind. For these countries, this wasn't just about money. It was about respect. About showing the world that debts would be enforced and power would be defended. So they chose the strongest tool they had. Warships. In the early 1900s, naval power was law. A fleet offshore meant trade could stop overnight. Ports could be closed. Governments could be forced to bend without a single soldier setting foot on land. But there was one problem. Venezuela was in the Western Hemisphere. And that meant the United States stood directly in the way. The Monroe Doctrine was simple, but dangerous. Europe stays out of the Americas. No colonization. No permanent interference. For decades, this idea sat quietly in the background. More warning than weapon. But now it was being tested in real time. Britain and Germany argued they weren't invading Venezuela. They weren't taking land. They were just collecting debts. Just enforcing international obligations. In their eyes, this did not violate the Monroe Doctrine. But America saw the risk. If European fleets were allowed to blockade countries in the Americas, where would it stop? Today a debt. Tomorrow a port. Next year, a permanent base. Debt collection could easily turn into control. The question hanging over the world was simple. Would the United States actually act? Publicly, Washington said very little. No loud speeches. No angry threats. No dramatic warnings. To many observers, it looked like America was staying out of it. But behind the scenes, something very different was happening. America did not rush to the microphones. There were no press conferences. No official protests. No dramatic warnings to Europe. Instead, the response was quiet. American warships began gathering in the Caribbean. Officially, they were there for training. Routine exercises. Nothing unusual. That's what the public was told. But the men in charge knew better. The fleet assembling was not symbolic. It was powerful. Modern. Ready. And it was placed close enough to Venezuela to act fast if needed. At the center of this move was a message that never appeared in newspapers. America was watching. America was prepared. And America would decide how far this crisis could go. This was pressure without noise. Strength without headlines. A reminder to Europe that the Monroe Doctrine was not just words on paper. And soon, that reminder would be delivered directly, in private, where it could not be ignored. The message was delivered quietly, but it was unmistakable. Behind closed doors, American officials made their position clear. Europe could pressure Venezuela. It could demand negotiations. But it could not cross a line. No land seizures. No permanent control. No European foothold in the Americas. And if that line was crossed, the United States would respond. Not with warnings. Not with notes. But with force. This was not public diplomacy. There were no written ultimatums. No official records. Just a direct understanding between powerful men who knew exactly what was at stake. Europe had to make a choice. Push forward and risk a confrontation with the United States. Or step back and accept arbitration instead of domination. The pressure worked. One by one, the European powers pulled away from the edge. The blockade ended. The ships withdrew. Venezuela remained independent. No invasion followed. From the outside, it looked like a quiet resolution. But in reality, something enormous had just changed. When the crisis ended, most people barely noticed. There was no victory parade. No declaration of war. No dramatic treaty signed in public. European warships sailed home. Venezuela agreed to negotiate its debts. Payments would come slowly, through customs revenue, not through occupation. On the surface, it looked like a simple financial settlement. But the real outcome had nothing to do with money. For the first time, the United States had made something clear to the world. It was willing to use military power to block any outside force from gaining control in the Western Hemisphere. Not just colonization. Not just invasion. Any move that threatened American influence. This moment quietly redefined who was in charge. Venezuela survived the crisis, but it lost something important. True independence. From that point forward, its fate would be shaped less by Europe, and more by decisions made in Washington. And this was only the beginning. Because what happened in 1902 did not stay in 1902. It became a rule. A policy. A justification for future actions that would echo across Latin America for generations. What followed was not written into law right away. But everyone understood it. If a country in the Americas fell into chaos, the United States would step in. If debts invited foreign pressure, America would intervene first. Not to help those countries grow, but to make sure no rival power gained influence. This idea soon became official policy. America would act as the guardian of the hemisphere. Judge. Enforcer. Policeman. It claimed this role was necessary to keep Europe out. But in practice, it gave Washington enormous control over Latin America's future. Interventions followed. Again and again. Governments were pressured. Leaders were removed. Economies were reshaped. And Venezuela never escaped that shadow. Its resources made it too important. Its instability made it vulnerable. Its location made it strategic. What began as protection slowly turned into dominance. And that brings us back to the present. Because the same logic that guided America in 1902 still exists today. Only the tools have changed. The language has changed. But the goal remains the same. More than a century has passed, but the pattern is still there. Today, the pressure is no longer about unpaid debts. It's about oil, influence, and control. Venezuela sits on some of the largest oil reserves on Earth. That alone makes it impossible to ignore. But oil is only part of the story. What truly matters is who controls access to it, and who gains power from it. This time, the rivals are different. Instead of European empires, you see Russia and China. Instead of gunboats collecting debt, you see sanctions, seized tankers, and military deployments described as security operations. But the logic is familiar. When Venezuela aligns with America's rivals, it becomes a problem. When foreign powers gain influence in the Caribbean, alarms go off in Washington. Just as they did in 1902. The United States is not reacting to chaos. It is reacting to history. And this is why Venezuela keeps returning to the center of global tension. Not because it seeks conflict, but because powerful nations see it as a prize they cannot afford to lose. Which leads to the most important question of all. Venezuela matters now for the same reason it mattered before. It sits at a crossroads of power. Its oil reserves are enormous. Larger than almost any country on Earth. Control over that oil means influence over energy markets, prices, and supply chains. In a world already tense and divided, that matters more than ever. But oil alone is not the real issue. Venezuela has become a symbol. For the United States, it represents a line that cannot be crossed. A test of whether outside powers can establish real influence in the Western Hemisphere. For Russia and China, it represents opportunity. Proof that American dominance can be challenged close to home. This is why warships return to the Caribbean. Why sanctions tighten. Why tankers are stopped. Why every move is watched so closely. Venezuela is not just a country in crisis. It is a message. A warning. And a battleground of influence. And when great powers compete like this, history tells us something uncomfortable. It is rarely the powerful who suffer most. The real warning isn't about warships or oil tankers. It's about patterns. History shows us that when powerful nations compete, smaller countries become pressure points. Their sovereignty shrinks. Their choices narrow. Their people pay the price, no matter which side claims victory. That was true in 1902. And it is true today. Back then, Venezuela was trapped between European creditors and American power. Its future was decided in private meetings, far from its own people. Today, it stands between American pressure and Russian and Chinese support. Different flags. Same reality. The language has changed. The technology has advanced. But the logic is identical. Venezuela is not being targeted because it is weak. It is being targeted because it matters. And the most unsettling part is this. In 1902, the crisis ended because someone backed down. Because the cost of escalation felt too high. Because pride gave way to caution. Now, the stakes are higher. The players are more numerous. And the consequences are harder to contain. History is asking the same question again. Who will blink first? For more than a century, the pattern has held. Pressure builds. Fleets move. Threats stay unspoken. And at the last moment, someone steps back. That's how the world avoided war in 1902. Not because Venezuela was protected, but because the great powers decided it wasn't worth the risk. Pride bent. Power paused. History moved on. But this time feels different. The resources are bigger. The alliances are deeper. The rivalries are sharper. Venezuela is no longer just a debtor nation. It is an energy giant. A strategic foothold. A test of whether old rules still apply in a changing world. And the same question that hung over the Caribbean more than 100 years ago is hanging there again today. Will power restrain itself? Will history repeat its restraint? Or will this be the moment the pattern finally breaks? Because if no one blinks this time, the consequences won't stay in the Caribbean. They will reach the entire world.